towards equity and poverty eradication. So moving on to the second kind of cluster of, second major cause of legitimacy, procedural legitimacy. Here we talk about normative judgments concerning the process through which decisions are made, which in turn then can have a number of subcomponents. At the international level, fair participation of states has often been raised as kind of a proxy for a democratic process that is universal multilateralism. And all the three multilaterals were initiated by a small group of powerful states. In two cases, in APP and MEM, they invited the most powerful developing countries. So you have the number of states ranging from about 8 to 15 in these forums. And this compares then to the UNFCCC, which has virtually universal membership. Of course, many argue that you cannot just look at governmental participation as a proxy for democracy. You have to add other factors to kind of come to some kind of idea of democratic process in global governance. One factor often referred to is non-governmental participation. And here, the UNFCCC has institutionalized procedures to approve observers from the civil society, and they can be there in the thousands, and at least the most capable of them are able to interact with negotiators. In contrast, these three unilateral forums had virtually no interaction with civil society whatsoever. There were a couple of some symbolic exceptions in G8, but that was about it. Then, if you're going to have good participation by states or non-state actors, that depends on transparency of the process. You have to be able to have information if you're going to engage in lobbying and decision-making. Now, the UNFCCC makes most of its draft decisions, all of the proposals of the negotiations publicly available. Of course, there are some interim documents that may not be available for observers, and of course, the most sensitive negotiations are also closed. But on the other hand, the multilaterals had a complete lack of reporting systems. You cannot get information more than very general declarations coming out of them. You cannot see which country had what position or coming into them. So the lack of openness of the multilaterals and limited reporting, both of positions and also of what they do to follow up on their commitments, make them very intransparent. Going into accountability, here we can look at accountability from three different perspectives. The first one is, to what degree do participating states in these institutions hold each other to account for the decisions they have made in terms of implementing them? You do have a very limited, almost non-existent reporting process in the multilateral forums, and that makes it extremely difficult for participating states to hold each other to account for implementation, even if they would like to, although, for example, the culture in the G8 is very much not on that. The UNFCCC, on the other hand, does provide for more reporting, but of course the compliance mechanisms are extremely weak. There is something in Kyoto Protocol, so it's not doing very well in legitimacy in that sense either. The second aspect of accountability is to what degree citizens of the states who take part in these institutions can hold their governments to account for the decisions they make and how they implement them. All three unilateral forums, particularly the MEM and G8, they are examples of an extreme type of executive multilateralism, as terms it, where policy is in the hands of the executive branch of the government. And then, whilst UNFCCC treaties have to go through ratification, etc. I think I will have to skip the last part of accountability, which is more towards the global public. Very briefly, the only way the global public can hold these to account is through the media and public pressure. But if there's no information on implementation, that makes it very difficult also in the multilateral case. So moving on to substantive legitimacy, that has, in our framework, two components. One is the problem-solving effectiveness. And here, of course, the UNFCCC regime is not renowned for its effectiveness in addressing climate change. It has very ambitious long-term objectives, but not very ambitious short-term real action. On the other hand, the multilateral forums have no baselines, no reporting, and thus it's impossible to look at if they are have an impact on emission reductions or not. The second indicator is about to what degree the outcome and the eventual impact of these relate to distributive justice in terms of equity. And here you do have at least the principles in theory. The UNFCCC does favor very much least developed countries approach, while the multilateral forums, as I previously mentioned, are not considering the issues of vulnerability and adaptation. So in summary, we argue that based on both source-based, process-based, and substance-based legitimacy, the multilateral forums fare much lower than the UNFCCC, but UNFCCC is not doing great either. And for the conclusions, well, more the conclusions, I leave to Jeff. Just give me that slide.
So I think it's fair to say from Sylvia's analysis that there's significant deficits in the normative legitimacy of these multilateral forums. So why do we say that these multilateral forums are important in understanding what's happened in terms of this fragmentation of climate governance at a state-to-state level over the last few years? Well, if we look at some of the key ideas and key norms that have been first raised in these multilateral forums, we see some interesting relationship to power in terms of the position of key countries, and also we see some of these ideas trickling back into the UNFCCC process. Just very quickly, because I know we're running short of time, but in relation to the process of international climate governance, what we see, or what we have seen, I guess, from the APP through the major economies process and the G8 process, is key developed states, particularly the US, but also some key developing states like China and India, being prepared to accept discussions, dialogue on key aspects of architecture and ambition in this small group setting. At COP15, of course, there was somewhat of a crisis atmosphere, a necessity to reach some agreement, but also some very clear indications in that context of, again, a willingness to go back to these small group settings for powerful states to carve out an agreement that we eventually reached in the form of the Copenhagen Accord. So, in terms of process, the necessity to push this small group negotiating approach, we would say, started through these multilateral forums some 5 years earlier. In relation to the influence of these multilateral forums on outcomes, I think it's fair to say that most of the last decade, certainly at an international level, there was an ongoing contest between those countries that wanted to push forward with targets and timetables under the Kyoto model and those who wanted to create something else. Again, if you look at these multilateral forums, particularly the APP and particularly the major economies meetings that were hosted by the Bush administration, there's a very strong advocacy and articulation of a voluntary pledge and review architecture for the post-2012 global climate regime. And of course, again, in that sort of crisis atmosphere of Copenhagen, it seems that a fallback position became the voluntary pledge and review model that we saw in the Copenhagen Accord, which was later accepted by all countries essentially at Cancun. So again, the ideas, the ideational contestation to develop a different approach, we see as developing in these sites, these forums for dialogue outside the UNFCCC process, sites that and forums that have been created by power and which have sought to give legitimacy to those forums outside the UNFCCC. So I guess in conclusion, because I know that I'm out of time here,